Could you build a business that's better for our planet? That's what I have set out to answer. Hi, I'm Marco Pimentel, marketing expert and entrepreneur, and host of the podcast Someone Like You. I've become fascinated in finding creative climate solutions in business, and on the podcast, I break down how founders and CEOs are building climate-friendly business solutions that are opportunities for growth while being better for the planet.
Many of the stereotypes of, farmers and ranchers like knowing their land is deeply true. There's infinite variables that go into figuring out what you should do in a given place for your desired outcome. Soil carbon is no different. That means that my ability to tell you this is what you should do in your specific circumstances is very limited. That's why measurement is so central.
Almost half the land that can support plant life on Earth has been converted to either croplands or pastures, and more surprisingly, that transformation took away between 50 and 70% of the soil's ability to store carbon, contributing to a quarter of all man-made global greenhouse gas emissions. Enter Chris Tolles. He's the CEO and co-founder of Yardstick. He took global warming personally and believed soil offered a good solution to slow down the rapid increase of the planet's temperature. A businessman always surrounded by scientists, he started his journey as an undergraduate in furniture making and turned entrepreneur by co-founding a company in the skincare and sun protection market before pivoting again. In this episode, I get to speak to Chris about what made him choose soil as the focus of his work, the impact he hopes to make on agriculture, and his mission and motivation behind the business. Yardstick believes it's possible to increase climate-positive agriculture and change the health of our ecosystem while also improving farmers' livelihoods in a win-win situation that brings a much-needed positive note to combating climate change. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Soils and the impact it has to carbon and the agriculture industry. Of course, we talk a lot about just food and growing food and the impact that has. But before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty of all of those details, I'd love to just understand your background and the correlation it might have into climate or sustainability. Was there a correlation? Were you thinking about it? How did it kind of come to be?
Yeah, so I have perhaps an atypical background for the CEO of a tech company working in climate. I went to art school undergrad. I have a degree in furniture making. But early in my career, I had an awesome experience of an early stage company that was taking university research out of the lab and putting it in the real world. This was in the world of solar cooking. So not photovoltaics, not electricity generation, but taking direct solar sunlight, concentrating it on a pot. And when you take a square meter of sunlight and put it on a few square inches, things get hot very quickly. So this was a textbook example of some MIT engineers had a great idea. Hey, let's bring it to market. That product, obviously, being energy focused, has a lot of climate parallels. And certainly for my whole career, I've been keen to work on things of substance. But definitely haven't had an explicit climate change theme to all of my professional experience. That first startup opportunity, very much so, and obviously right now again. But largely what I've focused on since that first startup is being the business guy alongside a co-founding scientist. So I went to RISD. I also got an MBA. I very much self-identify still as a designer. I'm just a designer of the enterprise now rather than a product or a piece of furniture. And that has brought me to Yardstick, which is that same opportunity of world-class scientists doing great research, and to have impact, it's got to make it out into the real world.
And when you were in school to work on that science project, bring it out, the solar project, what was your role there? Like, were you working on the bring to market opportunity from the lab into the real life?
I mean, the company was like 6 to 8 people, so we were all kind of doing everything. But no, my role was product design. I was the first employee. I wasn't a founder, but I was the first employee to lead product design. I hired and led our product design team. The company was based in Hong Kong because we were manufacturing in China and launching in China. So I was initially hired here in the Boston area, which is how I got connected to the the founders who had an MIT background, but the whole company relocated to Hong Kong for me to lead that product team. And that's actually a big part of what spurred me towards business. Is that company, which is called Run Earth Designs, was a remarkable team and a remarkable technology and a really worthy problem. But I think we had high quality product leadership and not excellent commercial leadership. We just didn't know what we didn't know. Like we were a bunch of product people. And there's this thing around a product called a business model, which matters a lot. And I realized, if I'm not comfortable solving the economic problem here, if I'm not comfortable solving for the design problem of our business model, how is this thing going to have impact? So the company is no longer around. I left midway through in order to leave to go to business school. So even though I was hired to focus on product design, it definitely revealed for me the importance of business leadership in any company that's trying to have an impact, because that's how you live or die in the market.
And in between, working for this company as well as starting Yardstick, you're also a founder and CEO of Sundaily. And and how did that kind of experience impact moving into Yardstick?
Oh man, yeah, this is quickly going to turn into founder therapy rather than just a bio sketch. So Sundaily was absolutely the same story as Yardstick in that it was science commercialization. I had an incredible co-founder, a woman named Amelia Jaworski, who was a dermatology researcher at Harvard Medical School here in Boston. And she's like, hey, I've got this fern compound, and when you eat it, it works like sun protection, works like sunscreen. Which is like pretty wild, but there's real literature, and she's a real scientist with evidence to share. And I got religion around this opportunity, same as she had. So it's the same playbook of, wow, we have this amazing original science that's been done, but it's products in the real world that can make a difference, in this case, in sun protection and skin health. That was a totally different business in almost every other way, though. It was direct e-commerce, it was subscription, it was in skincare, sort of brand-led, brand marketing. Direct e-commerce obviously means paid social and performance marketing, Facebook, etc. I sold that company in 2020 to Grove Collaborative, a premium online retailer, kind of Whole Foodsy, and don't intend to ever do another consumer product. I think it's a pattern of founders never wanting to do the thing that they did first, because you see what's so hard about it, right? And certainly in my case, I've not forsworn the problem of sun protection. I still deeply admire Amelia. I believe in this active ingredient, but man, it was not a good fit culturally for me to be leading a company in skincare, and one who had to spend a lot of our energy thinking about performance marketing on Facebook and whatnot. So when I sold that company, I was absolutely confident that I wanted to repeat that process of science commercialization, but I wanted to focus on something way more technical, way more B2B, and certainly Yardstick fits the bill.
And so if the theme kind of runs true, Yardstick also was kind of built with a mindset of in the lab and then I guess out into the field. I know, no pun intended there, but how did that get, was that how Yardstick was started? And how did you kind of make the connection to getting that started?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's exactly what happened. Reflecting on my Sundaily experience, you put things in buckets of like, all right, that's something I want to do again. This is something I don't want to do again. The thing I didn't want to do again, at least right away, was consumer products, e-commerce. The thing I did want to do again was science commercialization. That was a great fit. Some of the most fulfilling parts of that whole experience were my relationship with Amelia and working together to figure out, hey, how do you balance scientific integrity and commercial success? How do you speak to a consumer with a marketing message that nonetheless is does right by the real science that's underneath? So definitely knew that I wanted to start another company with uncommercialized science as the foundation. This was summer, fall 2020, so not a great time for in-person networking. I joined MCJ, My Climate Journey, which has a Slack group. At the time, the Slack group was just blowing up. It was really cool, fun. Hey, here's a community around people keen to think about climate solutions. And I got in there with a pretty mercenary attitude of like, hey, I think, there could be another co-founder in here for me. So I was cold DMing people and being like, "Hey, what are you working on? I do business things. Do you want to be friends?" And one of those is my now co-founder, a guy named Kevin Meissner in Oakland, California. So he had already built a relationship with Christine Morgan, who's a soil scientist that worked on this for many, many years. Christine is currently the chief scientific officer of the Soil Health Institute, SHI, that spent a lot of her academic career at Texas A&M University. Kevin had found Christine. I was like, "Hey, Christine, like your research is amazing and could have impact." And then I found Kevin, and by extension, Christine as well. And so we were sort of a triumvirate in fall 2020 that put together the premise that we would bring this to market. Yardstick is the commercial entity that emerged from that, led by Kevin and myself, with Christine in a key advisory role. But she's not an employee. She's probably best thought of as chair of our scientific advisory board. She's still full-time research scientist at SHI. And it's really her primary academic research at Texas A&M that is the foundation for much of the technology, especially behind our hardware at Yardstick.
And when you connected, where was the state of the kind of science in the lab? And I guess kind of like what thesis was sitting there that's like, hey, this is working in the lab. I think we can now kind of take this into kind of a commercial opportunity. Kind of what stage was it at?
So it was an excellent research tool, I think is the best way I would summarize it. Christine is the type of soil scientist who really gets her hands dirty. She is in the field. And so this wasn't like the concept of in situ spectroscopy for soil carbon. This was her like actually building stuff, with her students and her postdocs over many years, but nonetheless, like building real things, testing them in real fields. The difference is that in order to publish a great paper, you do a bunch of sampling on one or two fields in Illinois. And then maybe the next paper, you use that Illinois data and you try and use it to predict soil carbon in Texas. It's excellent, but it's all incremental. It's relatively modest in absolute scale, in terms of acres. And that's appropriate, right? Like that's how you do good science, is you do small experiments at a time and then you grow from there. That meant that there wasn't just like one great paper, because science is iterative and it's a body of evidence. So to see things that are ready to become a company, you want to see, 6, 8, 10, 12, 20 or more papers where folks are broadly agreeing on the same point. And that's really was. Soil science as a discipline, I think, broadly agreed that spectroscopy is a very promising measurement technology for soils generally, but particularly for carbon. Christine had led much of that research. And so there was a track record both of a large group of soil scientists around the world who had spent time with soil spectroscopy and left being encouraged. And wow, I've got a front row seat to Christine, who herself led many of the most influential papers in that domain. But when you look at the thing that she actually built, you're like, I don't know if that's going to go the distance, right? Like, I'm not sure that could do 1 million acres because it's not designed for that. That's not its purpose. And that's really the inflection point, is we could see that pattern in evidence. We could see the incredible expertise in Christine and her team to guide us. And we knew that we were the ones who could figure out how to take it to that 1 million acre scale. I am not a soil scientist by training, nor is my co-founder Kevin. But like Kevin worked at SpaceX, Planet Labs is a great company who worked at, built satellites for years and years and years. We are the ones who can take that awesome research tool and turn it into a thing that can work in the real world of markets and customers at scale. That's really the position of the research at the time, is that we saw enough there to be the raw material for us to build a commercial offering around.
And before we get into obviously the solution being Yardstick, and obviously the massive opportunity that just understanding our soil has to climate change, I guess before this, what's the current problem? Or I guess obviously there's two sides to understanding what our soils are doing and how they've been depleted and releasing carbon into the atmosphere, but in general also the problem of just how do you measure it before solutions were there. And so like, what were you and your co-founders staring at as this kind of glaring problem in the market?
Yeah, so there's really 3 problems. Problem number 1 is climate change. We probably don't have to spend a lot of time talking about that. Problem number 2 is, wow, soils are both a massive source of emissions and a massive potential solution. And again, that's from the literature. One of the things I respect most about Kevin is he's really a first principles guy. And so by the time I started talking with him about these opportunities, he had already done an enormous amount of research to better understand the scientific consensus around the potential of soils. Soils as a source of emissions come from many sources, but to kind of oversimplify for non-soil scientist types like myself, a lot of the industrial farming practices that we've employed for the last 150 years have caused soils to lose stored carbon. So imagine tillage, which many normal people call like plowing. You're turning the soil upside down. And that's good in terms of killing weeds, for example, but it is bad because you're taking the soil house and you're turning it upside down. And, that wouldn't feel good if it were your house. So many of the carbon compounds that used to be, for example, 30 centimeters underground are now at the surface. And that's not where they want to live. There's a reason they were happy underground. So tillage is a perfect example of the kind of practice that has resulted in losses of soil carbon stocks in the US as well as around the world. And the potential is to put that carbon back and even grow it to be greater than its original state. And that's really a product of soil scientist community saying, hey, what's the holding potential of soils? How do they interact with plants? Because it's the plant that places, if you will, much of the atmospheric CO2 into compounds that are living in soil. That's the second problem is both, man, we got to reduce the real emissions that are a product of these farming practices, and we got to figure out how to activate soils as a carbon removal or carbon storage solution, much the way we think about forestry. Problem number 3 is like, okay, great. How do we know it works? Which is fundamentally a measurement challenge. The way to measure soil carbon conventionally today is with physical soil sampling. So you take a piece of the soil, you mail it to an agricultural lab, and again, to oversimplify, they basically incinerate it. They have a piece of equipment that can therefore measure the carbon content of those soils, typically measured in organic carbon concentration. That's a percentage, anywhere from, call it 0 to 4% would describe many agricultural soils of the US. That works in the sense that it's available. You can call up most major agricultural labs and they say, yes, we have a test for soil carbon. The problem is it's incredibly laborious and it's expensive at the lab. And the labor matters because that's a data integrity challenge, right? When something is exhausting, eventually even the best field teams break down. And it's a risk when your field team is tired and therefore collecting low quality data. Plus the unit cost to get this measured at a lab is very high. One of the main reasons it's very high is because there has not been an economic incentive to measure soil carbon at scale previously. And so the analytical tools are relatively immature. Those are the 3 problems that Kevin and I, and certainly Christine, were on the same page about. Hey, climate change, a worthy problem, definitely something to get out of bed for. Wow, soils have all kinds of challenges, incredible opportunity to reduce real emissions and activate soil for so-called CDR, carbon dioxide removal. And then great, if we're going to do that, how do we measure what's doing what? The conventional approach to physical sampling and combustion at a laboratory isn't going to go the distance. And that's where Christine and others' prior work in soil spectroscopy becomes really compelling.
And here comes Yardstick. How did you bridge that gap with the solution that was able to work with kind of the market and obviously, maybe we'll talk first just about the solution. And then I'm just very curious about the customer base. Like, how do you go to market with this? How are the customers receptive? I'm assuming these customers are pretty large scale farming and agriculture operations. And like, has it been a very kind of push or pull market? So but understanding what kind of solution you did or you have come to market with.
Yeah, so let's talk about our offering itself first, and certainly happy to include some photos or a video as well for context if that'd be helpful. Imagine a giant hand drill. The hand drill has a big drill bit on it, and that drill bit is about 2.5 feet long. At the tip of that drill bit is a sapphire lens. There's fiber optic through the shaft, and then there is a camera in the hilt of the drill, near where you would hold it. As you're drilling down into the soil, that tip, the sapphire lens, is passing past the soil. We are shining a light out of the sapphire lens. Light is reflecting off the soil, back in, up the fiber, to the video camera, the spectrometer that's in the hilt. We're taking a movie of the soil. A corkscrew-shaped movie, as you're drilling down. But nonetheless, from that movie, we can measure organic carbon content the same way a lab would. Point-of-care diagnostics for the farm is another way to think about it for folks that are familiar with that from healthcare. We're taking a laborious and expensive process that is not going to go the distance and saying, hey, here's an optical technology which is both easier to use and lower cost without compromising scientific rigor. That's the core of our hardware offering. Of course, everything is a data platform these days. We are as well. We have a whole software offering where we design sample plans, capture this data, store it, blah, blah, blah. But the core original science research, especially that we have inherited from Christine and others, is this premise of reflectance soil spectroscopy for carbon. That's our offering. It looks like a big hand drill. You use it by drilling into the soil. And Yardstick is a service in the United States, so we are hired on a per acre or a per sample site basis. It's Yardstick people holding the Yardstick technology. Our field team is world-class. They're inseparable from a lot of our technology leadership on the probe and the software. And so customers buy what we are selling by essentially hiring us to go measure soil carbon on their farms, fields, or ranches.
Every week on Someone Like You, we dive into stimulating conversations with founders, entrepreneurs, business owners, and the likes who are consciously and successfully creating sustainable business solutions for the long haul. Tune in every week for a new inspiring conversation on leading climate solutions. And if you're enjoying the podcast, don't forget, please subscribe on the platform of your choice and give us a rating and a review. And your team, as they go out there and are doing these testings, is the immediate kind of customer base or your agriculture partners. Are they paying? Is this saving them money, or is it more about accurate data and accurate measurement that is quicker to being able to make decisions? Like, what for them is the initial driving point to make this change?
Well, for better or worse, everything is about money if you get down deep enough. So in our case, there's a variety of motivations. But the reason Yardstick exists is because we believe that measuring soil carbon is important for many different reasons. The one that makes most sense to many folks intuitively is to enable soil carbon offsets. So the premise is that today's agricultural practices are suboptimal. If we had an economic incentive to change behavior, man, we could get it, right? When someone is willing to pay more for corn, folks are more willing to consider corn to be the thing that they're growing. When folks are willing to pay for lower carbon intensity corn or tons of CO2e as offsets from a farm, I started thinking about farming carbon rather than just farming corn. The premise is there are ways of farming with lower climate impact. Right now, the economics of those practices are not sufficiently compelling. And so offsets are a way of making up the difference. So a farmer would say, hey, I'm very willing to change my practice, love the mission, but I don't love the mission if it comes at the cost of feeding my family. So typically Yardstick's customer is not the farmer, rancher, or land manager directly. Our customer is typically what's called a project developer. And this is a company that exists to define that offset system that I just described. What standards are we going to align to? What management practices should we change? Where in the world are we? How are we going to measure these things? Who are buyers of the offsets that come out the other end of this process? Those are companies like Indigo here in Boston, like Truterra. Most big ag organizations have some sort of soil carbon program at this point. The details can be very different, but most fundamentally, all of them are in the business of saying, hey, we agree there's an opportunity here to change management practices, address the climate impact of agriculture, and get paid. In order to get paid, you have to have a thing to sell. The thing you're selling are offsets, and the protocols describe a process by which you must measure things in order to be awarded those offsets to sell. So that's why our direct customer, our paying customer, is not the farmer themselves. Our customer could be a brand. Organic Valley, for example, is a customer of ours. And they say, hey, we want to pursue lower carbon intensity milk. We're going to go to our dairies and say, hey, everybody, We would really love it if you could bring us some lower carbon intensity milk. Here are different ways we have of approaching that. Yardstick is going to measure your soil carbon as a baseline. We'll come back a few years later and take a look at the difference. That means Organic Valley is my paying customer, even though Yardstick is boots on the ground with the individual dairies that are participating in their program.
Yeah, and that enables these brands and these companies as well as the farmers to have, when it comes to permanence or when it comes to being able to say that this carbon offset is true, is you need that measurement piece in order to be able to do that, and that's incredibly important. And I think
that's the whole thing. It's an
that's the
intangible
whole
good.
thing.
When you're selling corn, eventually, like, you either have corn in a truck or you don't, right? Like, there's a silo that is full of something or it is not. Offsets are an intangible product. The whole point is that it's not in your hand because it's underground. It's staying underground, or it was sent underground. So think about being a buyer of an intangible good. The best analogy is probably electronic banking. Like, I take it for granted that when I log into my bank and it shows me how much money I have, I actually have that money. Like, that's because I have the full faith and credit of the United States government and FDIC and many other, many century-long efforts to establish trust in that system. Soil carbon is not there, right? Offsets are not there. If anything, offsets are plagued by challenges of quality and integrity. And so to be a seller or a buyer of this intangible asset, man, you need to have measurement data and there are other systems, of course, that support it, but measurement data is absolutely inseparable from the fundamental economic premise that you're going to hand me actual money and I'm going to hand you a PDF, a number that's in a database somewhere. It's a very challenging system to make work in the real world because of its intangible nature. And that's why we believe we're working on one of the most fundamental pieces, which is measurement.
And when it comes to the amount of carbon that's able to be stored, and because you're able to do this baseline, and my assumption is these farms or these agricultural companies that are whatever their products are, most of it, I'm assuming, is switching to regenerative farming, the no-till processes or different tillers that are more sensitive to the land, cover cropping. Like, have you found that all those solutions are there? It's just, implementing and being able to see like this and this benefit of being able to now measure and see the difference, and farmers probably being like, oh wow, this is not only helping us being able to sell these offsets, but we're getting better soil, we're getting better crops because of it. Like, how is that connection, or is that tied into some of the success that you're seeing?
Well, that's why they exist, is because there isn't sufficient systems confidence in the causal relationship between management practice X and good outcome Y, whether Y is tons or soil health or yield or whatever you care about. If I knew that by adopting this particular kind of tillage, I could expect carbon intensity outcomes of this, I actually probably wouldn't have to measure anything, right? Like, because I know, because there's a causal relationship that's established. On balance, there's a very strong body of evidence that there are management practices that can change the climate impact of agriculture. Bringing that down to the level of your farm, your ranch, considering your specific soil, your irrigation, your microclimate, because you're in this weird little cleft of the mountain, blah, 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 like hopelessly complex. That's why humans are great algorithms for this decision making, right? Like, we've been practicing agriculture for many, many centuries. And that's why many of the stereotypes of, farmers and ranchers, like knowing their land is deeply true. There's infinite variables that go into figuring out what you should do in a given place for your desired outcome. Soil carbon is no different. That means that my ability to tell you this is what you should do in your specific circumstances is very limited, very, very limited. That's why measurement is so central. Today, Yardstick is largely focused on describing what's going on. Okay, we did a baseline. We came back 3 years later. Here's what happened. In the future, what gets us really excited about Yardstick is our ability to move from a description role to a prescription role. Not just here is what happened looking back, but based on our understanding of soils like yours, crops like yours, your neighbors, we think it's more likely that this will have the impact that you want. We're not there yet, though. In aggregate, absolutely those solutions exist. But look at the definition of regenerative agriculture, right? It means 14 different things to 14 different people. So while the moving pieces are there, they're not sufficiently well organized. We don't agree even on definitions of different words. Anybody who has farmed will scoff at the idea that like till and no till are two different things, right? There are 17 different shapes of tillage. There's different depths. There's different frequencies. Man, the permutations multiply very, very quickly. And in order to separate that complexity and to actually start to establish what works or doesn't work, and therefore be able to inform management practice, I'm sorry to be a broken record, but I'm the CEO of a measurement company. Like, we need better measurement. That means on a given plot of land, like the solutions are out there, but the likelihood that somebody can tell you here's what to do is very, very limited.
And I have seen this in kind of real life. I met with a farmer who owns a vineyard, and it's a regenerative farm that he's been working for about 7 or 8 years. And in the region this year had a massive die-off because of an early winter freeze in the area. And he said, I didn't really have any winter freeze die off, or everybody else had about 30 to 40%. But at the end of the day, he still puts his kind of shoulders up in the air saying, I don't know, I think it's because of the stuff that I do. Right. I think it's because of the health of the soil, but I don't know,
right?
what's the correlation? Yeah.
And that's the central challenge here. I heard an amazing quote earlier in my career that said, the plural of anecdote is not data, which I think is basically trying to illustrate that stories are powerful and individual examples are incredibly important. And at human scale comprehension, we can only really work with like individual examples at a time, right? And nonetheless, especially in the regenerative agriculture community, golly day, if I see another side by side farm photo that's like the farmer on the left blank and the farmer on the right black, and you're like, is that really the only difference here? Like, give me a break. Unfortunately, that's the evidence with which we make decisions. So I don't begrudge someone who says, "Hey, wow, the big floods, big rain in California earlier this year," and there's a great article about whether farms and ranches that practice regenerative practices had reduced runoff, better water infiltration. Awesome, fascinating conversation to have. I sure wish it were as simple as, because person X did Y, they didn't experience the die-off from the freeze. And I give your friend a lot of credit for saying, like, hey, I mean, I do this for a reason. I sure hope it matters. But at the end of the day, it's so hard to establish what really is happening here. That's why we focus on measurement. That's why we have all the enthusiasm in the world for the incredible variety of solutions that are out there. But man, I do not envy people who have to decide today how to actually change practices.
Yeah. And when you think about anything to do with farming or agriculture, time is typically against these farmers in terms of how long things take to understand what type of change. We're not talking a year, we're talking sometimes 5, 10, 15 years. So to be able to have a tool to be able to measure and provide data on both sides is incredibly, incredibly important.
Yeah. And I think there's real cultural tension here too, because, like I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I know a teeny little bit about soil and a teeny little bit about farming, just by way of the privilege of working at Yardstick. But like that's not my people, right? I don't understand those systems deeply. Instead, I fit much better with a lot of the kind of coastal tech culture that expects things to work on cycle times of days or weeks, right? Hey, I got an idea for a new feature. Great, ship it. And I think there's profound tension within the climate community of a lot of tech culture people not appreciating that natural systems and natural ecologies work on fundamentally different timescales. And that's challenging. I've had a number of investors be like, what do you mean you can't tell what works in soil carbon between the spring and the fall? And it just didn't, it was like cognitive dissonance for them. They were like they couldn't understand how you could not possibly understand impacts on a timescale of something as enormous as 6 months. That's hard because we got to make decisions now to avert catastrophe. We won't, right? We will already. Many people around the world are already experiencing catastrophe today. The urgency is profound, and the time cycles of understanding are long. That is a brutal, brutal combination.
And when you think about, Yardstick, obviously you built a brand that, to me really kind of stands out in the market, and especially who your customers are and who you're trying to achieve this to. But if you just kind of think and maybe just plant a bit of a picture for our audience in the next kind of 3 to 5 years, like what is the mission, and where do you see Yardstick, where do you see Yardstick playing in the market?
So the company exists because we believe that this data is valuable in many, many ways. We've talked about offsets because they're interesting and it's a coherent example of where measurement is important. But we often talk with the Soil Health Institute, and they joke that they're called the Soil Health Institute and not the Soil Carbon Institute for a reason. There actually is a bigger goal here than some would argue the reductive engineering mind of CO2e. Carbon tunnel vision is a great thing to Google if you haven't read much about it. But it basically says hey, for all the challenges of addressing climate change, what if we accidentally focus too narrowly on one thing to the exclusion of others? That's, I think, a key part of our long game is if we believe that soil carbon is essentially important, and thankfully SHI itself has published data that shows that organic carbon content is the single best predictor of soil health. So great. We're headed in the same direction. But nonetheless, how do we as Yardstick make sure that we are appropriately motivating and incentivizing carbon markets, for example, which are an essential tool, and also not getting sucked into carbon tunnel vision, who can miss the forest for the trees? I think it's very feasible that we, quote unquote, solve climate change and we create other problems which are also catastrophic. I want to understand how Yardstick can be a measurement technology that nails the question of organic carbon content. Nails it. Absolutely. And I want to be a company that gets beyond that narrow lens of carbon to say what's the full potential and opportunity of soils to do good in the world. That includes oftentimes soil's most fundamental role, which is growing food. Right? We can have a long conversation about whether U.S. industrial agriculture is actually focused on growing food. It's largely not, right? That's not hard to establish. But nonetheless, it does produce a lot of food, and especially on a planet with a growing population and a growing population with so-called, middle class tastes, like for beef. There's incredible tension between the desires to have lower carbon intensity agriculture and the real threat of actually increasing the climate impact of agriculture because we decrease productivity. If we grow less food with every acre, then where do those acres come from, right? That, I think, is this bigger challenge of systems thinking in food and agriculture that acknowledges the essentially important math of CO2e and also says, let's not fix one problem and cause another.
Yeah, we don't have the time or the resources to be able to do that, I don't think. And so to kind of wrap up the conversation, I'd love to just ask a question at the end, which is there's a bit of the branding and inspiration for this podcast came from the book The Lorax. And of course, it's just this classic tale of one person's kind of responsibility to their environment and how this kind of seed of change can empower a movement. And if I think about your story, what's so compelling, I think too, is as you said, you're a product person and you've wholeheartedly came into this market and poured your heart and soul to build this and really want to have impact. So what do you say to entrepreneurs or people that want to get involved in something that is climate related?
So one thing is I find a lot of folks who don't immediately understand how their skills are relevant. And they are. That's what's great is the challenge is that climate change will affect everything. That's a challenge because it's scary. That means a lot of harm and a lot of change in the world. The upside, if you want to take one, is it's going to touch everything, which means literally whatever you do, there's a climate angle to it. I think go on record saying pretty literally whatever your job is today, quote unquote, not working in climate, there's a climate angle. So those career pivots, I think, are often more accessible than many people realize. And certainly, if anybody wants to riff on that with me, I love helping people figure out opportunities. Reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever. But I love helping folks orient their career more towards climate if that's something they're motivated by. The other thing is really like audience specific. So I find a lot of people of means, especially white people, have a lot of climate guilt that's pretty unacknowledged. And this is, a kind of new and emerging area of psychology that basically says like, hey, when we do have these like existential uncertainties, like what happens, inside our brains and our hearts, especially in America, which is really the only culture I can speak to. White people, and especially white men, like have been far less likely to have experienced any sort of existential uncertainty in their life than people of color or women, or certainly the combination of both of those. And I find, therefore, a lot of very well-intentioned people of means, whether class or income benefits or the ability to move in a kind of a white-dominated society with comfort, don't often reflect on that fact, that they're coming into existential uncertainty having not faced this before. And that creates a lot of weird behaviors. The urgency one I mentioned previously, I think, is one challenge in climate, that there's all this talk about we got to do stuff now, but we also got to get it right. And that's a tough combo. So I find most folks that are trying to get into climate tend to have some career flexibility, which means they're more likely to be either educated or wealthy or white or what have you. And that's kind of a deeper psychological reckoning that I think is really important for folks, to not bring a kind of assumption around pace that I think ultimately could hold back some of the best solutions. I think there's a lack of collaboration and a lack of appropriately patient problem solving in some instances, even as I acknowledge the urgency of the problem. And to be clear, that's really only me speaking to fellow white people, or especially white men. But I do think there's a great opportunity for folks like me to step back and to at least challenge or question some of the techno-optimism, like, we just got to do it now. We don't have time to see if it's safe. We don't have time to understand second-order effects. That's some of the same thinking that got us into this problem, And so I'm eager to see, especially fellow white men, show up to that conversation with enthusiasm as well.
Yeah, and it's I read a book, Vaclav Smil, I believe, How the World Really Works. And when you read that book, it's quite daunting to understand how all these big, complex problems work in our world. And if you think about putting an urgency mindset to it right away, it's like, well, how would you, with an urgency mindset, even be able to figure out how to deal with these problems? I think we need urgency, but we need urgency when companies have a solution in front of them and they want to be able to test them or want to be on board with them or invest in them. Those are the type of urgency decisions. But like you said, less about we have to solve it right away. We have to do it. We have to do it right. Where can listeners, you mentioned yourself for LinkedIn, but where can people find out more about Yardstick? Obviously, you guys are on the heels of a over $10 million recent Series A, which is amazing. Congratulations. That allows you and your team to continue to build this solution so that we can have this incredible impact. But how can people find out more about Yardstick and yourself?
Yeah, use yardstick.com as our website. We're on LinkedIn and Twitter as well. Also as use Yardstick on Twitter. I'm Chris Doles. You can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn as well. Always happy to hear from folks any way I can be helpful.
Well, Chris, thanks very much for joining us today. It's a credible story, and we are cheering you on as you and your team build this tool for agriculture, and I'm excited to follow it over the years.
Thanks so much.
This podcast is co-produced with The Brand is Female. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode of Someone Like You. And if you did, please share this. We're a new podcast, and I would love it if you could share it with a family member, friend, colleague, work colleague. Share it on Slack, whoever you do. Just share and spread the message of these incredible brands. Please also support these type of companies. They're doing the hard thing, and the hard thing often takes a lot of people to get on board. And don't forget, please subscribe on the platform of your choice and give us a rating and review. I'm Marco Pimentel. Thank you for joining us today. For more information on Someone Like You, you can find us on Instagram at Someone Like You Podcast, with all the links to the podcast, our website, and more information about the brands that we feature. Thank you again.